Hello, my name is Krastina. I'm an assistant professor here at the economics department at UW-Whitewater. I'm excited to be joining the Fairhaven series. The only regret is that the lecture has to be pre-recorded instead of having the talk with you, but that's one of the caveats of the ongoing pandemic, which is also something that I will be talking about today. And in particular, I just want to share some thoughts on how eventful 2020 has been. And unfortunately, some of those events have been rather adverse. It's the year when the world had to face the global pandemic. And at the same time, it's an election year here in the United States, a presidential election year. So there is a lot going on, and there is a lot at stake. So I wanted to think about the relationship between these two events. How do they interact with each other? And then a natural follow-up question is how in the past times of crisis have influenced the outcome of presidential elections. So jumping right into the heart of this question, here are a couple of well-known examples of crises, and we're looking at how the approval rating of the politicians in charge changed after those crises. So we're looking at Margaret Thatcher and the Falkland War, we're looking at Jimmy Carter and the Iran hostage crisis, George Bush after 9/11, Bush after the Gulf War, and Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor. So not only didn't the approval rating didn't suffer, but they actually saw significant approval or bump in approval. So in all of those graphs, we're starting at 0 and then we're going up. So the approval rating increased anywhere between 20% to shy of 60 percentage points for the political leader in charge. So again, these leaders didn't suffer any penalty for having to deal with an international crisis. On the contrary, they saw a significant bump in their approval rating. Now, not every crisis seems to be the same. In the next set of data that I'm showing here, we see just the opposite. So Tony Blair suffered a significant disapproval after the London bombings, Paris Paris attack, and Hurricane Katrina again gave a penalty to the politician in charge. So how can we think about these two conflicting pieces of evidence? Well, one idea is to think about the first set of events as being international conflicts, while the second set of events are domestic crises. So during international conflicts, academia has dubbed this rally around the flag phenomena, in which voters reward the politician in charge. And what you have going on during those episodes is a surge in patriotism, which leads to meeker opposition, and that essentially becomes a boom for approval ratings. During domestic crises, well, the penalty probably comes from putting some blame for failure to police domestic terrorism or providing a lackluster response to a natural disaster. So where does COVID fit in all of this? Well, it's hard to put it in either one of these buckets because there are just quite a few elements to the COVID pandemic. So first of all, clearly a huge public health crisis and the global scope to that. So it's an international crisis in nature. It's disrupted normal day-to-day activity. But it's also brought on an enormous economic distress. And I've highlighted that because this is something that I will emphasize in my talk, because I'm an economist by training, so that's what I know most about. So it's, right off the bat, it's hard to tell which way approval ratings are going to go based on what we've seen so far with other big crises and events. So looking at where approval ratings went right after the World Health Organization announced the pandemic on March 11th. So these are the early days still of the ongoing pandemic. And here we have a sample of 10 countries. Most of the political leaders in charge have seen actually this rally around the flag significant bump in approval. And here Australia's Morrison, Canada and Germany are sort of leading in terms of the bump that approval ratings have, in terms of bump in approval ratings. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have Brazil and Japan. Abe in Japan was probably penalized for Japan ranking pretty poorly relative to its neighbors' outcomes in terms of managing the pandemic. Now, where is the United States and the president? Well, the approval rating for Trump actually remains pretty flat in comparison to the other countries. So he fails to get the bump in approval rating, but he also doesn't lose ground in those early days of the pandemic. Now, we can ask ourselves, well, why is that? Why are some leaders getting this improvement in approval ratings and other leaders aren't? And it seems that it really is about how seriously the leader took the pandemic and how much that seriousness was expressed in their public messaging. Because, for instance, here we have France, Macron doing pretty well, despite the fact that France was struggling quite a bit at the time with the pandemic. So it's not only about objective outcomes, but it's also about what the leader expressed in terms of concern or lack of concern. That seems to have swayed opinion quite a bit during those early days. Now, in terms of objective outcomes, and it's probably hard to talk about outcomes while the pandemic is still going on and there's so much uncertainty, but this is data from Johns Hopkins University, and this is data on the 20 most affected countries by COVID. So the US makes it to this group, so that's already telling about the impact of COVID. Now, this is a very somber statistic. It's the mortality rate or the case fatality ratio. What that fraction tells us is how many cases which have tested positive have resulted in deaths. So here the US is in the company of a lot of emerging and developing economies. The other developed economies are France, Spain, and the UK, and they are ahead of the United States in terms of mortality ratio. So although being in this group of 20 most affected countries, among its peers of developed countries, the mortality rate in the United States is lower than these other developed economies, which is somewhat encouraging. In terms of other comparisons we can draw, we should take into consideration that differences in the mortality ratio or the case fatality ratio are to an extent also driven by how many people are getting tested. So the more people you test, the more you get milder cases, so your ratio falls. So a country that tests more will tend to rank lower here. But differences between developed and emerging economies are also going to stem from differences in healthcare. There, probably the ratio is going to be higher for the emerging economies. And then differences are also going to come from demographics, because we know that that's something that influences the outcome of having contracted COVID. So here, this is going to be actually helping emerging economies out a little bit and decreasing their case fatality ratios. If we were to look at a similar statistic, slightly correcting for the number of people who get tested, that's deaths per 100,000 people. Again, the US is part of the group, and it's actually edged upward, and it's ahead of its other developed peers, which is actually sombering and something to be definitely concerned about. Now, how has all of this, and I have just very quickly reviewed the pandemic in its starkest aspect, but how has the pandemic influenced voters' choice, if you will? Well, here we're looking at some data that I pulled from 538. That's a website that publishes basically an aggregated consensus polling data. It uses a very large number of polls. It pretty much uses all available polls that publish their data publicly, and there are very mild requirements for a poll to make it to this aggregation. So based on this consensus polling data, Biden is ahead. It started ahead in March, so we're starting in March over here, and we're looking at what happened to voters' approval over time during the pandemic. And in particular, this is basically voters answering the question who you would vote for. So this is not exactly Trump's approval rating. This is a slightly different question about voting preferences. Well, it looks like the period which has the pandemic contained in it has basically diminished the re-election chances for Trump. Biden has widened his lead. This is the end of September. We see that the gap is wider compared with March. And the biggest gap the widest gap between Biden and Trump is during the summer months, as you can see. And if you look at state-by-state data, that is there as well. The biggest lead for Trump, the biggest lead for Biden happens in the summer months. All right, so the data seems to suggest that although the effect is small, there is definitely some loss of confidence in the president during the starting with the onset of the pandemic. And I did mention that an important aspect of the pandemic is the economic duress that it has brought on. And here is a picture that we already looked at. That's the approval rating for Bush. We did mention this bump in approval that we see shortly after the Gulf War. But as time continues, and we're tracking his approval rating basically 12 months after the event, his approval rating declines and takes actually quite a dip a year afterwards. So what happened there? well, it's the economy stupid, right? So every time we think about elections and the economy, we go back to this famous phrase coined by one of the campaign managers for Clinton. So this is an example of a situation in which the economy diminished the re-election chances of the incumbent. Now, this is not the only example we can think of. We can easily think of Reagan in the 80s. We can think of Roosevelt during the Great Depression, both of them unseating the incumbent president, and we have this being accompanied by a recession, and the recession having a big sway in voters' preference. So it's not unnatural to ask, okay, we have the pandemic recession, how is that going to influence the re-election chances for Trump, or how has it influenced them? Now, it seems that over time, in recent years, the economy has actually stopped having this same influence it used to have on voters. So ebbs and flows in the economy, this regular occurrence of recessions in the economy, which are short-lived, used to sway voters' preference. It doesn't seem to be the case in the last cycle of elections that we've seen. So starting in the 2000s, there is something that has captured the attention of many academics in political science, in economics. It's something that normally people call polarization. So polarization means that the outlines, the partisan outlines have become more rigid. You don't see voters jumping to the other side that often, and you definitely don't see that many voters jumping on the other side because there is weakness, because there's temporary weakness in the economy. Now, polarization basically also entails the fact that voters seem to care more about identity issues. So these are political beliefs, religious beliefs, and they don't seem to allow the economy to influence them that much. So does the economy even matter anymore? Big part of this polarization that has been going on in politics, which doesn't allow the economy to sway voters, is this hardened perceptions or difference in perceptions depending on which side of the divide you're on. So there is some interesting research in that area that I've tried to summarize very briefly here. Partisanship seems to matter for the way people perceive economic events. So if we are asking ourselves, well, why is it that we all care about the economy, recessions influence everybody, why are we not voting on those issues? And here is a brief list of things that economic research has brought to the table to sort of enlighten why economic issues have paled in comparison to other issues. Well, first of all, partisanship seems to matter for the way people perceive economic outcomes. So we've known this for a long time. This is not a recent phenomena. If you look at Bush approval rating during the recession, basically the approval rating among Republicans and Democrats goes down as the recession progresses and as the election in which Clinton will unseat Bush comes near. Now, if you compare, however, how the approval is declining over time, there is a gap there. The approval among Republicans is declining, but it is overall Republicans are overall more positive. So this gap is basically due to partisanship. So everybody is experiencing economic duress, but Republicans are less likely to disapprove because of that. A couple of more recent results that have been established, and they're probably reflecting this polarization that is going on. There has been a selective pattern in which partisans learn. So that's very interesting. It turns out that Democrats know more facts and are aware of more things that tend to support the Democratic platform. And the same thing happens for Republicans. They're aware of more things and they've learned more things that support the Republican platform. What is even more interesting is that media coverage seems to matter. This disparity in terms of what everybody knows along partisan lines is bigger when the event has had more media coverage. So it looks like this emphasis on different events really comes from, to a big extent, from the news sources that everybody is going to and learning from. It looks like Democrats are going to news sources that are leaning more on the Democratic side, and Republicans are going to more news sources that emphasize, again, facts and things that support the Republican agenda. So this is creating, again, a divide, and economic events objectively don't sway voters as much. And now the last piece of evidence here, the nice thing about economic indicators is that we can measure this, and we can measure them, and we can put a number on them, and we can all look at them, and they give us this basically benchmark that we can look at. And then if you go out and ask people about facts, they seem to be giving a partisan answer to factual questions. So I have an example of this on the next slide. This is from a study done in 2015. Inequality, social inequality, is an issue that Democrats are likely to be more sensitive to. So if you ask voters 3 factual questions, the correct answer to all of these, to all 3 questions is yes. So this study went out and surveyed voters and asked them these factual questions. Well, it looks like voters are getting those right or wrong in a partisan way. So Democrats are more likely to correctly answer the question, has income inequality increased in the United States? So that's basically showing us this partisan response to factual questions. The other 2 questions are related, and again we see that Democrats are more likely to get them right as they relate to something that is part of the democratic doctrine. Republicans, on the other hand, are less likely to get them right. So perceptions seem to play a role in this hardening of political lines, and the ebbs and flows of the US economy seem to be playing less of a role in determining how voters are going to cast their vote. Now, something interesting here, while these short-run events, the recessions and the weaknesses in the economy that are short-lived, they take a couple of quarters, a couple of years to heal, maybe they are not as important as they used to be in the past, but in the last wave of elections in which President Trump won, for instance, seem to be, also based on economic issues. It's a different set of economic issues. So the economic issues that seem to prevail in the last cycle of elections, the big ones here are basically trade, automation, so both of these things affect jobs, as well as the housing market. So these are different but still economic issues. In terms of trade, that's basically, if you ask most economists, they're going to be free traders, they're going to support international trade. However, it's undeniable that there are winners and losers from globalization, from trade. So the people who are on the losing side have definitely been, their decision to vote has been influenced by that fact. And there is an interesting study that found that in European areas that are more affected by competition from China, voters are more likely to cast a more nationalist vote in the last cycle of elections. Another interesting piece of evidence, automation. Areas in the United States affected by automation, which replaces jobs, were more likely to vote for President Trump in the last election. And then finally, the housing market. How has the housing market affected things? Well, there it's the dispersion of house prices. So in areas where house prices are low, people feel trapped. So it's less, it's a lot more difficult to move out of these areas. Selling your house will not buy you a house in another place. So areas which in Britain saw lower housing values were also more likely to vote for Brexit. And again, areas with high housing values were more likely to vote for the status quo. So there has been discontent founded from economic issues, but these are long-run economic issues, issues that are founded in economic trends that take a couple of decades rather than a couple of quarters. Now, this is the pre-COVID world in which some economic issues have become less important and others have come to the forefront, mostly fueled by globalization. There is an interesting article in The Economist from late last year that discusses exactly the role of economics in voting, and it's very aptly titled "Can't Buy Me Love." Now, the authors of this article basically hypothesize that the state of the economy, whether the economy is in a recession or struggling, must still matter in extremis. Now, they ask the question, would President Trump's approval rating really hold up if unemployment went from 4% to say 20%? And they wrote this in November 28 last year. Now, they almost tempted fate with this question because although things didn't get as dire, they almost did. So we do have actually sort of an answer, although an imperfect answer. What happens if instead of a mild recession, we have a whopper of a recession? Now, on June 8 this year, the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee announced that they find that the US economy has entered the recession in February 2020. So just a couple of words here. The NBER is a non-profit research organization, and they have a team of economists that basically announce beginnings and ends of recessions. It sounds like an easy job, but it's not, especially when the data is coming in. It's actually fairly hard to distinguish where does the recession, exactly at what point in time the recession starts and when does it end. So we want to think of the recession starting at a peak of economic activity and ending at the bottom, at the trough when the recovery starts. The consensus opinion about recessions and their timing comes exactly from the Business Cycle Dating Committee. And to just mention something briefly, they use a number of economic indicators in a rather holistic way to actually set those timings, beginnings, and ends of recessions. So, according to their chronology, we were in recession as early as February, and as the announcement was made, the economy had most probably already entered a recovery. So, the pandemic recession puts an end to the longest expansion or the longest recovery. We have had 128 months since the end of the housing crisis or the Great Recession. And that is, as I mentioned, the longest recovery on record since 1854. Now, as states put quarantines in place, economic activity basically ended up contracting very sharply in March and April. And there was basically this recession is unusual in many dimensions. One dimension in which it's unusual, it's the really sharp descent into a recession. We're going to see some data and you will see how this is quite different from the pattern we've seen in the past. The other difference is that the recovery, the onset of the recovery was actually very quick. And this sounds like a good thing, and of course it's a good thing, but the caveat there is that it's been a slow recovery. And some economists have actually betted on a double dip recession. We haven't seen that, but the recovery has been slow. All right, so we're going to take a quick look at real GDP. So that's a broad measure of output in the economy. It's a broad measure of income in the economy. Gross domestic product, GDP, it's real because it's been adjusted for the effect of rising prices. So the economy contracted 9% in the second quarter of 2020. And as you can compare, what we're seeing here is the path of GDP since the 90s. We have three previous recessions. Those shaded bands in gray are telling us where these recessions were. So we had the Great Recession, the early 2000 recession, and the 90s recession are plotted here. So if you look at the dip which real GDP took, it's much bigger than what we saw in the previous recessions. A 9% contraction basically brought the level of GDP back to its 2015 quarter first level. That basically suggests that the pandemic recession erased roughly 5 years worth of economic growth. Of course, this is temporary, but it's a substantial decline. Now, this recession, as we already are seeing in the pattern of the recession, is quite different from what preceded it, from the recessions that were before. Now, here is one difference, another probably difference, the way it's impacted different sectors of the economy. So, what I've plotted here, we have employment or change in employment in manufacturing, that's the red line, and we have also the change in leisure and hospitality. So again, these gray bands are showing us where the three previous recessions happened. And what I want to highlight here is that manufacturing tends to decline more precipitously in terms of employment during recessions than a type of service industry, which is leisure and hospitality. And if you look at the post-recession years, manufacturing is basically either flirting with negative growth. It actually never recovers into positive territory after the Great Recession, and that's reflecting long-run trends in manufacturing decline. So what this is telling us is that manufacturing responds more during a recession. Well, not in this recession. Actually, the drop in manufacturing employment, although substantial, really pales in comparison to what leisure and hospitality has seen. And again, another pattern, the disparities here, the reversion is here, meaning that leisure and hospitality suffered a much more substantial decline in employment than manufacturing. But also the other thing I want to highlight is the different shape that economic indicators are taking in this recession. So we see this V or radical shape here, a very precipitous drop followed immediately by a recovery. This is basically an unusual pattern compared to previous recessions. We wish probably that the shape was more like a V, but it's more of a radical shape because of the slow recovery. Now, other service sectors have been hit also pretty hard in the current recession. So this is basically showing not only leisure and hospitality, but other leisure sectors, education and health, and professional business services. So overall, employment in these sectors, in the service sectors, tends to be more recession-proof than manufacturing. That's what the last 3 recessions have taught us. With education and health services being sort of recession-proof, that's the green line, you see that there isn't a decline during a recession in these service categories. Let's look at the current recession. Again, the pattern is changed. All of the service sectors outstrip the drop in manufacturing, and this recession-proofness of education and healthcare isn't there anymore. So healthcare has been hit pretty hard, so has education. And that is basically because COVID has changed the way we can consume those services. In healthcare, a lot of healthcare activities were postponed just so that capacity can be opened up for COVID as well as to contain infections. So service sectors were hit harder than manufacturing. Now, apart from thinking about how this recession is different in that respect, this is also important for another reason. And this is a figure I like to show my undergraduate students. Over time, this is basically a pie chart, one for 1960 and one for 2012. And the pie chart is telling us the fraction that each category, manufacturing, services, and agriculture, are claiming from overall production in the US economy. So as you can very clearly see, the share of services has increased over time, and that has happened mostly at the expense of manufacturing. So that's reflecting the transition of the US economy into a service economy. This is not true only for the US. Basically, most of the developed economies have swayed this way towards a service economy. So as services become a bigger contributor to GDP, the fact that they took a hit in the pandemic recession becomes important for overall production and for the whole economy. Now here is another interesting economic indicators. What I like about it is that it is we have daily observations on this indicator. This is spending as measured by JP Morgan. They publish data on the value of consumer spending as reflected in their Chase card transactions. Well, again, we see basically the figure is telling us how much spending based on these credit card transactions changed year over year from 1 year ago. And you can see that as the quarantines come in March and April, spending takes a very substantial hit. It decreases by 40% compared with previous year. And again, we see this radical shape, a very quick recovery as quarantines are lifted. The beginning of the recovery comes in quickly, but it's a slow and painful recovery. Spending remains depressed by 5% compared with last September. And here is something interesting. This is again the same data, but now it's broken down by spending category. We can really marvel at the hit that a lot of the spending categories are taking. Restaurant spending was reduced by more than 50%, lodging and airlines more than 100%. A category that didn't suffer but rather actually registered a gain during the pandemic. This is basically grocery shopping. So as we were stocking up on necessities during the quarantines, you see these big spikes in supermarkets, and it's all the way here in supermarkets and wholesale. So apart from groceries, most other major categories took a substantial hit, and it's taken them a really long time to recover. They're still spending in these other categories is still subdued. Unemployment, this is something very important, or maybe it used to be important for election outcomes. So the unemployment rate peaked at more than 14%, almost 15% in April 2020. For comparison, in the Great Recession, where the job market struggled pretty badly, the top unemployment figure was 10% in October 2009. So we definitely surpassed the Great Recession. As a matter of fact, 14.7% is the biggest peak in post-World War II data. Now, America will be going to the polls with 7.9% as the unemployment number, which is the last number published by the BLS. And that almost 8% is double the unemployment rate that was there before the pandemic hit. So February 2020, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. And also another comparison, if we're trying to think, well, what if the pandemic recession didn't happen? Well, the last unemployment figure before the pandemic recession set in, as I mentioned, was 3.5%, and the average unemployment rate during the Trump's presidency has been 4.3%. So things got bad pretty much all of a sudden with the onset of the pandemic recession. Now, this figure, the unemployment rate, is normally under a lot of criticism, and the criticism heats up during recessions. The reason for that is that normally the figures on unemployment, the unemployment rate that is normally cited, that tends to give us a potentially too rosy idea of what's going on in the job market. And that problem becomes a bigger problem during recessions. So during recessions, the figure tends to underestimate the number of people who are underemployed. And that's because a number of cases that the BLS has data on sort of fall through the cracks. So what this data is missing in the current recession is people who are employed but might be furloughed, or another example of people who might be falling through the cracks are people who are working at reduced hours. And they might be working at reduced hours because of childcare or having to care for another family members. So there are many dimensions in which the pandemic influenced the labor market that are probably not captured by the statistic. So an EPI economist, that's the Economy Policy Institute, a non-partisan think tank, an economist there basically tries to think about, well, how do we correct those mismeasurements? So she comes up with 33 million workers as the figure in terms of workers being affected by the pandemic recession. So the havoc in the unemployment in the labor market that the pandemic has caused, regardless of our choice of how to measure it, is undeniably really big. Now, here is another way unemployment figures are important. So what we're seeing here is employment growth after the 6 last recessions. So what is interesting here, as you're already noticing, 2 years after the recession, we would expect, as the economy recovers, the labor market to recover as well. So people to return to jobs and things to pick up in the labor market. And that was certainly the experience in '82 and the '70s. However, if you look at the last 3 recessions, the pattern we're seeing here is different. The economy has recovered, output is on an expansion path, but things in the labor market aren't getting much better for a while. So 2 years after the recession, the impact of the recession lingers in the labor market. And that has been the experience in the last 3 recessions. So a natural question to ask is, okay, if this is the experience in the last 3 recessions, and we saw this major problem in the pandemic recession, should we expect this bad impact of the recession on the labor market to linger for a while, which is definitely problematic? Now, here is an opinion on that by Paul Krugman. You probably know him as one of the Nobel laureates in economics. You might also know him for his strong political views. This view here is not political. This is Krugman as an economist. And basically, he is offering some cautious optimism on the question of how long will the impact of the pandemic recession last in the labor market. He basically buckets recessions in 2 categories. So the first category is that's where the last 3 recessions fall. In the last 3 recessions, there was a problem with the economy. It was built in the economy, and those were basically overvaluations or booms in different parts of the economy. So the housing bubble pre-Great Recession is an example of a boom in the housing market, a boom in technology for the 2000 recession. These are situations in which, as I already said, there is a problem built into the recession. The other recessions, the older recessions that we saw, the ones where the labor market flourished right after the end of the recession, those were situations when the economy was plunged into a recession because there was an outside shock. So essentially, the OPEC crisis, the resulting inflation, Volcker's disinflation, these were all instances in which there is someone or something that is putting the brakes on the economy. Once those brakes go away, the economy goes back to normal and the labor market goes back to normal. So in a way, the second type of recessions, those earlier recessions, were easier to cure. And as a result, the labor market rebounded more quickly. Now, where do we put the COVID recession? There has been some economic weakness before the pandemic recession. The Federal Reserve started cutting interest rates later in 2019, basically expecting or reacting to some weakness in the economy. But that wasn't anything major, especially in comparison to what happened in March and April. So Krugman tends to think that the pandemic recession is actually an early type of recession, a recession that once the pandemic goes away, things are going to rebound quickly and go back to a healthy growth after the pandemic goes away. Now the question is, how and when does the pandemic go away? And that is probably a much harder question to answer. Now, the other thing that I do want to mention is we do see this slow recovery pretty much in all of the economic indicators that I showed you, and we can see it in many others. So there is the recovery starts very quickly, but the pace of the recovery is low, and given that the economy took a very big plunge, things are going back to normal at a relatively slow pace. So why is that? Well, this last question and the uncertainty surrounding this last question that I asked basically illustrate why the recovery is so slow. When consumers face uncertainty, they tend to save more. So that's why spending, as reflected in JP Morgan Chase tracker, isn't recovered yet. It's because this uncertainty is preventing people from returning to their normal consumption patterns. And the other thing is, although quarantines are over, again, the risk of contracting COVID isn't really allowing people to return to their pre-COVID consumption patterns. The other thing that is slowing things down is policy. So I'll talk about policy next, but many provisions are under the CARES Act expired in the summer. Another fiscal measure is probably not coming until the elections. So this uncertainty, the fact that the helping hand of policy is going away, and the uncertainty surrounding any new legislature there is also holding down spending. The other thing, state finances. So the states did get provisions under the CARES Act, and I have seen estimates that suggest that in most cases these provisions will be enough to cover shortfalls this year in state budgets. However, revenue is likely to remain depressed for another 2 years for different states, which means that states are very likely to start cutting spending now. This is also something that holds down or holds back the recovery, as it did in the last recovery after the Great Recession. And the other thing with state balances is that some states are struggling more to balance their budgets than others, whereas the provision is pretty much giving the same amount to every state. So some states are going to be struggling more and cutting back on spending more than others. And I already touched on that. I mentioned the CARES Act. This is, as we know, a $2 trillion package, the spending package that was passed at the end of March. So there are quite a few groups that benefited from that. Individuals, that was the $1,200 paycheck, $500 per child in terms of the economic impact payment. Unemployment insurance, extending unemployment insurance, this was also something very important that was part of the fiscal response. So basically eligibility was extended, the number of weeks that people are entitled to unemployment insurance was extended, and also people got an extra unemployed people got an extra $600 dollars per week. So that was an important measure, and it turns out the economic impact payment and the unemployment insurance payment, those turned out to be successful measures overall, One estimate of that provided by the census is that 13 million people were basically saved from falling into poverty by these two measures. Other beneficiaries of the CARES Act: big corporations, small businesses, that's the PPP, the Payment Protection Program that got a lot of attention. State and local governments, I already mentioned that, and there are also a couple of other beneficiaries of this fiscal policy package that came in March. Now, as I already mentioned, we are already seeing that at least some of these measures were rather successful in containing the pandemic impact on workers and small businesses. However, this expired in the summer. So the PPP closed on August 8, and in July, the 600 weekly unemployment benefit also expired. So, as I said, this is something that, without being replaced, is essentially holding recovery back. We already covered that. Now, the Federal Reserve has already stepped in as well. The Federal Reserve is politically independent. They are in charge of monetary policy. They are politically independent. Their mandate is price stability and maximum employment, and that's the mandate that they work under. They aren't allowed to be swayed by political considerations. So that's something to keep in mind. That being said, when monetary policy is successful in lifting the economy out of the recession, that matters also for the incumbent president, because probably voters can't really distinguish where the economic success is coming from. So what is interesting about the Federal Reserve is that normally the way monetary policy works is the Federal Reserve cuts back a short-term interest rate, and in this way it allows more borrowing in the economy to finance consumption and investment, and allows the economy to get lifted out of the recession. And this is what we call conventional monetary policy. It's conventional because basically you'll find that in every textbook. If you wonder what does the Fed do, how does monetary policy work, this is what you find in economics textbooks. Now, conventional monetary policy didn't cut it in the last recession and ran out of ammunition very quickly in the pandemic recession as well. And that's because of something called the zero lower bound. That's basically telling us that nominal interest rates don't go any lower than zero. Normally, we don't pay people to borrow money from us. It goes the other way around. So the federal funds rate hit that zero lower bound in the Great Recession, and right at the onset of the pandemic recession, the Federal Reserve brought down its policy rate back to zero again. So once the policy rate is at zero, there is a question: if you are the Fed, what do you do next? What additional measures can you use once your main policy tool doesn't have any ammunition? So in the last recession, we saw this non-conventional monetary policy called quantitative easing, in which the Federal Reserve bought long-term government bonds as well as asset-backed securities, targeting not short-term rates but long-term rates, interest rates. In this recession, again, the Fed found itself in a situation to resort to non-conventional measures. So the Federal Reserve stepped in a very major way, buying different asset classes. It set up 11 lending facilities, and as a result, its balance sheet mushroomed to 7 trillion. This is an unprecedented figure. So these 11 facilities, what they do is they provided liquidity, and they provide liquidity for different asset classes. Now, in many cases, small and medium-sized businesses don't participate in these financial markets that the Fed is buying assets in. So in this way, the Fed faces a political sort of reputational risk that they're helping Wall Street rather than Main Street. And the other caveat here is that in the pandemic recession, small and medium-sized businesses were disproportionately affected compared to their larger peers. So that's in terms of employment, that's in terms of business exits. And in response or anticipating criticism along those lines, what the Fed has done is it set up this Main Street lending facility. So what you're seeing on the slide is a list of these 11, they're not exactly 11 because some are grouped together, but these 11 buying facilities that the Fed set up. And the Main Street one is part of the mix, and it's an important part of the mix because it was set up to support loans going to small and medium-sized firms. So the way it works is that the Federal Reserve uses that facility to finance loans to small and medium-sized businesses through the banking system. Now, what we're seeing here, the black bars on each of the category is telling us how much of the allocated funding has been used up so far. And the take-up of the Main Street facility has been pretty limited, as you can see. So compared with the PPP, the fiscal package program, that program hasn't seen the same amount of usage. And the problem there basically is that businesses have to go through a rather lengthy and complicated procedure to get a loan under this facility. Banks find it hard to navigate the application process as well. So that facility hasn't seen as much usage as the PPP, which saw really a deluge of applications. So that, that brings us back to fiscal policy and the fact that given the zero lower bound on nominal interest rates, which have been low by historical standards, fiscal policy becomes very important in helping the economy during this rather slow and painful recovery. And then just to quickly wrap up what I want to say about monetary policy, I know that my colleagues from the economics department are also going to be talking about monetary policy probably more in depth than me. So another policy measure that, a rather important policy measure that the Fed adopted is that it basically changed slightly the way it interprets its mandate on price stability. So at the end of the summer, the Fed made an announcement that it's going to change the way it interprets its goal of 2% inflation. So before, the Fed was holding itself rather tied to this benchmark of 2% inflation, but as inflation has been very mild both in the United States and Europe during the last recovery, it has actually allowed itself to allow inflation to go more than 2% during recoveries, and in that the Fed is committed itself to keeping interest rates low longer than it would have had it stayed bound to the way it interprets its mandate since 2012. So the Fed is trying to navigate markets, or to promise that it will keep interest rates low even if inflation was to go above its 2% target by a quarter or 0.5% during the recovery. So in that, they're committing to a longer stay in the low interest rate phase. So that's another way in which the Fed has tried to stimulate the economy. All right, so wrapping up with the policy response to the pandemic recession, I want to go back to the vote and try to think about, okay, we have this precipitous drop into a recession, a swift start of the recovery, but also a very painful and slow recovery, and we still don't know if how bad things are going to go. So what has happened to voting intentions? And here what we're seeing is a map, and the way the colors work is, first of all, the green states I don't have data on. Everything else that is shaded from very pale blue to dark blue, that's reflecting the loss in the lead for Trump in every state. So basically, I'm looking at the beginning of the pandemic. So the data starts in February 27, and I'm going all the way to sort of the most recent data to September 28. So if we look between the end of February and the end of September, and we look at Trump's lead in each state, has it declined or has it increased? Now, of course, in some states we have Biden leading, so that would be a negative lead for Trump. Now, the numbers are mostly negative, telling us that Trump has lost ground relative to Biden over the period of the pandemic. That is basically true for all states that I have data on. The only states where Trump has gained some ground against Biden is in the case of the states shaded in white, so that's Kansas, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, North Carolina. Florida, there is basically zero gain or loss for Trump. Things are pretty much where they were in February. Everywhere else, however, Biden has managed to go ahead relative to Trump. And if we look at where this has been basically most pronounced, we have the coasts, New England and California, as well as the Sun Belt states. A couple of battleground states that show large increase for Biden. Those are Arizona, Wisconsin as well. Texas also shows a modest increase in Biden relative to Trump. So it looks like the period definitely, decreased the re-election chances for the president. So a couple of numbers here. In New York, we have more than 8 percentage points going for Biden. Wisconsin, again, roughly 8 percentage points increase for Biden. Arizona, 7.5. The same situation in Colorado. Texas, a 2% increase going for Biden over this period. So in 31 out of the 37 states, we see Biden actually increasing the number of voters relative to Trump. And then the average increase for Biden is 4.4 percentage points versus roughly 2 percentage points. So more than twice the gain the gain for Biden is more than twice the gain in the gain for Trump in different states. So what this tells us is, yes, these months of the pandemic, whether it's the recession or the other aspects of the pandemic, seem to have taken a toll on the president's electability. So I go back to economic indicators. This is the unemployment rate broken down by demographics. There is a substantially bigger spike in unemployment for non-white workers, and the recovery, you again see the slow recovery, which has flattened according to the last figures in September. The recovery still puts those demographics at a disadvantage relative to white workers. So does that matter for who is being favored in the upcoming election? Here are again some numbers overall. This is the source of this data is YouGov. This is an online pollster. In overall, forgetting about demographics, overall, Biden leads, and that lead has doubled between March and September. For white voters, Donald Trump is still ahead of Joe Biden, and the lead for Donald Trump hasn't actually nudged over these months. Black voters, again, the lead for Joe Biden here hasn't really changed that much over the pandemic months, but this is a very substantial lead for Joe Biden. Going to the Hispanic vote, Joe Biden is ahead here, and there is a substantial gain for him brought on by the pandemic months. And the Hispanic vote is interesting because it is probably more easily swayed, I think. The Hispanic vote tends to go conservative on identity politics. Here we see, however, Joe Biden favorability going up during the pandemic months, very, very substantially. Here is another map. This is basically showing us the fraction of non-white population in each state. So again, the coasts and the Sun Belt seem to be more diverse than the rest of the country. And if we think back about this other map that I showed about where Biden has gained the most, there seems to be some coincidence between diversity of the vote and the gain for Biden over the pandemic months. Now, I already mentioned that the decline in unemployment has affected small and medium-sized businesses more than larger businesses. If we think about wages and who got affected more on the wage spectrum. So this is something that I've taken from a fairly recent study of exactly the effect of the pandemic on unemployment. And what they've done is taken pre-pandemic wages and split them into 5 buckets. Those are the quintiles that we see on the over here. So the lowest quintile, the lowest buckets, suffered a bigger decline in unemployment than the buckets over here where wages are higher. So what this means is that workers with lower wages were more likely to get laid off during the pandemic. Now, how does this translate to voting? Has it translated at all? And that is admittedly still very contentious. Here is a piece of evidence that tells us that it might have translated into voting decisions. This is a very recent poll conducted again by YouGov and The Economist, where they asked voters, will the economy get better under if Donald Trump is reelected versus under Joe Biden? And if you split, so overall, they're quite neck and neck. 41% overall think that the economy will get better under Trump, and 40% think that it will get better under Biden. If we break down the responses by household income. So we saw people with higher wages seem to have been more protected from the effect of the pandemic than people with lower wages. Okay, so now we are splitting the answers by household income. Folks with lower income are more likely to expect that the economy will get better under Joe Biden than under Trump. So here we can interpret this as the pandemic potentially swaying the vote or affecting people's economic expectations. Then households with higher income, whether we're talking about the second bucket, 50,000 to 100,000, or people with more than 100,000 annual income, they actually tend to favor Trump in terms of the economy. So part of this might be coming again from what we just saw, the disproportionate effect on lower wage workers. It might be also coming from expectations about taxation policy, who is going to go more progressive and more towards redistribution. So higher income voters might be actually thinking about that as well when they favor Trump versus Biden. Okay, so we've seen some of the evidence quite, as it is coming in. The election is just around the corner. There is a slew really of surveys and pollsters telling us sometimes conflicting information. But on the whole, has the pandemic hurt the re-election chances for Trump? Well, one thing we can tell is it's really hard to see a rally around the flag effect. So there hasn't really been an increase or an outpouring of support for the president during this crisis. On the contrary, things have remained flat, or he has actually lost ground against Biden, depending on how we cut the data. So no rally around the flag effect. That being said, it's really hard to tell how much of that is due to the pandemic and how much is due to other events that have surrounded the pandemic during the last months. I already mentioned that the biggest gain for Biden happened in the summer months, and that might be due to Biden getting some of the votes that would have gone to other primary candidates. But the timing of this also coincides with the racial equality protests and Trump's response to that. So apart from the pandemic, there is also other things going on, and those are likely to speak to this identity politics that voters have tended to vote on in the last cycle of elections. An even harder question is, if we say that the pandemic has hurt the re-election chances for Trump, how much of this is the economy and how much is the public health aspect of it? And that is probably a harder and deeper question to answer. So I'm going to finish with a bunch of questions being open. And I look forward to any questions or any feedback that you might have for me. Again, unfortunately, we couldn't do this talk face-to-face, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts, your opinions, or any questions that you might have. So I would be more than happy to get in touch, not face-to-face, but via email instead. Thank you.